This fresco is one of the most reproduced images in the history of Western art, printed in textbooks, hung in classrooms, referenced constantly as the picture of ancient philosophy. Nobody actually knows who most of the people in it are, and hidden in the middle of it is a tribute to the one artist Raphael was quietly competing with, painted just a few rooms away. This is the School of Athens, painted by Raphael between 1509 and 1511, on the wall of a room called the Stanza della Signatura, Pope Julius II's private library. Inside the Vatican, it shows dozens of figures gathered inside a vast, imagined hall, gesturing, arguing, reading and teaching, meant to represent the entire tradition of ancient philosophy in a single frozen moment. And here's the detail almost nobody mentions first. No document from Raphael's own lifetime explains who any of these people actually are. Every single identification you've ever heard is scholarly best guessing based on faces and props, made centuries after he died. This wasn't a quiet side project either. The Stanza della Signatura was just one of 4 rooms Raphael and his workshop were hired to decorate for the Pope. A years-long commission covering entire walls and ceilings, running at the same time as the single most famous ceiling in the building next door. Even the room's design isn't random. Each of its 4 walls was built around one branch of human knowledge: philosophy, theology, poetry, and law, arguing that all 4 eventually point toward the same truth. This wall is philosophy. Directly across from it, a completely different fresco called the Disputa handles theology. Poetry gets Mount Parnassus, with Apollo and the Muses. Law gets an allegory of virtue. 4 subjects, 4 walls, one quiet argument running underneath all of them. Reason and faith were never actually enemies. Even the title you know it by is a later invention. Raphael almost certainly never called it the School of Athens. The small painted roundel on the room's own ceiling, directly above this wall, is simply labelled philosophy, which is likely what he actually considered the subject. And before a single brushstroke touched wet plaster, Raphael's workshop produced a full-size preparatory drawing called a cartoon, nearly 8 meters wide, pricked with tiny holes and pressed against the wall to transfer the outlines, section by section. That cartoon, made entirely by Raphael's own hand, still survives today, not in Rome, but 400 kilometers away, in a museum in Milan. Somewhere in that crowd are also a sprawled figure lying alone across the steps, usually read as Diogenes, the Seneca philosopher who, according to legend, lived in a barrel and openly mocked the manners of polite society, painted here as the one man in the whole room who couldn't care less about being included in it. Lower left, a man kneeling over an open book is generally identified as Pythagoras, surrounded by students, while a young man beside him holds up a slate, covered in the Greek ratios for musical harmony ideas about music, a number that were already 15 centuries old by the time Raphael painted them. And over on the right side of the hall, near the geometry lesson, we'll come back to shortly, 2 more men stand facing each other, each holding a globe. One faces the viewer, holding a pale star marked celestial sphere, usually read as the Persian prophet Zoroaster, though some modern scholars argue it's actually the geographer Strabo instead. The other stands with his back to us, holding a solid, earth-toned globe and wearing a crown Ptolemy, the astronomer whose ancient model placed the Earth at the center of the universe, positioned face to face, globe to globe. They're staged as if caught mid-argument over what actually belongs at the center of everything. Close to 30 figures, packed into one imagined hall, and scholars still don't fully agree on any of them. Start with the 2 men everyone agrees on, standing dead center under the arch, one point straight up, holding a copy of Timaeus. The other gestures out toward the room, holding his Ethics. Almost every historian agrees. This is Plato and Aristotle, positioned to represent 2 opposite ways of understanding the world, the ideal and the observed. The book choices aren't random either. Timaeus is largely Plato's account of how the universe itself came to be, which is very likely why Raphael has him pointing straight up, toward first causes beyond the room. Aristotle's Ethics, by contrast, is a study of how people should actually behave in the world, directly in front of them, which is very likely why his hand stays low and level, aimed at the crowd around him instead of the sky. Here's the twist even careful viewers usually miss. Many art historians believe Plato's face isn't imagined at all. They think Raphael modelled it directly on a real, living contemporary Leonardo da Vinci. Silver, bearded and instantly recognizable, even in his own era. Think about what that means for a second. This isn't just a philosophy lecture painted on a wall. It's Raphael quietly casting the most famous living artist in Italy as the founder of Western philosophy itself, a compliment paid to a rival, hidden in plain sight, centuries before anyone thought to go looking for it. Now look down into the foreground, at the man sitting completely alone. He's slumped against a block of marble, resting his head on his fist, ignoring everyone around him, usually identified as the philosopher Heraclitus, famous for his gloomy outlook on life. He isn't in any of Raphael's surviving preparatory drawings for this scene. He simply doesn't exist in the plan. Physical analysis of the wall itself confirms it. This figure was painted onto a second, separate patch of plaster, applied on top of a section that had already been finished. Raphael cut back into his own completed fresco to add him. Fresco doesn't really allow for casual edits. Paint has to go onto wet plaster, section by section, in a single working day per Pascal, Tech, before it dries and locks the image impermanently. Choosing to plaster over a finished working section of your own masterpiece wasn't a small decision. It meant admitting the original plan wasn't finished after all. And here's why he did it: the part of this story that connects directly to a much more famous ceiling, just a short walk away. According to the artist Giorgio Vasari, writing later, Raphael managed to sneak a look at Michelangelo's ceiling in the Sistine Chapel while it was still unfinished, while the two men were technically professional rivals, working for the same pope in the same building at the same time. Raphael was reportedly so struck by what he saw that he went back into his own nearly finished fresco and added that brooding figure as a private tribute, modelling Heraclitus's face on Michelangelo himself. One genius quietly rewriting his own masterpiece, just to acknowledge another one being born in secret next door. It's worth remembering these two men weren't friends swapping studio visits. By most accounts, Michelangelo and Raphael had a famously tense relationship, each aware of the other's talent, and each reportedly guarded about their own unfinished work. A private viewing like this, if it really happened the way Vasari describes it, would have been a genuinely rare crack in that rivalry. Here's where the story gets stranger, because Michelangelo wasn't the only real person hiding in plain sight in this room. The balding man bent over a slate, demonstrating geometry with a compass, is widely identified as the architect Donato Bramante. This is the exact same Bramante who, according to accounts from Michelangelo's own circle, is said to have recommended him for the Sistine ceiling, specifically hoping he'd fail at it, and it was Bramante who personally recommended Raphael to Pope Julius for this very commission. The same architect, pulling strings for both painters, in what may have been two very different kinds of favour. Bramante wasn't a minor figure trading favours quietly either. He was the chief architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica, itself arguably the most powerful artistic voice at the papal court. Getting recommended by him could make a career. Being set up by him, allegedly, could just as easily end one. And it goes one layer deeper than that. The soaring barrel, vaulted hall every one of these philosophers is standing inside isn't purely imaginary. Historians of architecture generally agree its coffered vaults and echoing scale were modelled directly on Bramante's own blueprints for that new St. Peter's Basilica under construction at that exact same moment, a short walk from this wall. Bramante isn't only painted into the crowd as Euclid. In a very real sense, the entire building wrapped around every figure in this room is his design too. Raphael painted the man who may have helped make his career standing calmly at work, respected, useful, exactly as history would prefer to remember him. Raphael left one more signature in this crowd, and it's easy to find once you know where to look. Standing near the edge of the painting, beside the astronomer Ptolemy, is a young man looking directly out of the fresco, the only figure in the entire composition making eye contact with you. Most historians agree it's Raphael's own self-portrait. That's the same Ptolemy introduced earlier, still holding his globe, still frozen mid-argument with Zoroaster about the centre of the universe. And now, quietly, the painter's own face is watching from right beside him, as if he'd simply walked into the scene he was painting. He's not the only outsider Raphael chose to write into this hall, either. Just behind Pythagoras on the opposite side of the room, wearing a turban and a green cloak, stands a man generally identified as Averroes XII, century Muslim philosopher from Islamic Spain, and one of history's most influential commentators on Aristotle. For centuries, European scholars read Aristotle through Averroes's commentary before they read Aristotle at all. Raphael painting him into the Pope's own private library is a quiet admission of something rarely said out loud, that ancient Greek philosophy survived largely because Islamic scholars preserved and translated it, centuries before it ever reached the Vatican. And near the centre, there is a young figure in white, arms crossed, with a strikingly soft, almost androgynous face. The conventional identification is Francesco Maria della Rova, the Pope's nephew, included as a courtesy, but a persistent minority of historians, especially mathematicians, insist this is actually Hypatia of Alexandria, one of the only celebrated female philosophers of the ancient world, quietly written into an almost entirely male scene, with no announcement, and a haircut deliberately built to blur the question. Neither side can fully prove it. Raphael left no caption, no letter, no explanation, just a face soft enough that 4 centuries of historians still can't agree whether they're looking at a duke's nephew or the ghost of one of antiquity's most famous murdered scholars, standing calmly in a crowd of men who all outlived her by over 1,000 years. So look at this hall full of scholars one more time, the pointing hands, the open books, the marble stretching back into a sky that never actually existed anywhere in Rome, a philosopher's face borrowed from a living genius down the hall, a brooding figure added after the fact, cut into finished plaster to honour a rival glimpsed in secret, an architect playing 2 roles at once kingmaker for one painter and possibly saboteur of another, a self-portrait hiding in the crowd, the only eyes in the whole room looking back at you, and, maybe, one of history's few remembered female philosophers, standing in plain sight for 500 years, disguised as someone nobody ever thought to question. 2 astronomers still frozen mid-argument over globes, on a question this room never actually answers. A wall built for philosophy, standing directly across from a wall built for theology, quietly insisting the two were never really enemies. A Muslim scholar painted into a pope's private library, crediting a debt most textbooks still leave out. Almost none of it is confirmed. All of it is still argued about today. And somehow, that's exactly why people can't stop looking at it. A textbook full of certainty, printed on top of a wall full of open questions. Every face in this room was painted by one very real, very specific man, working under a real deadline, for a real pope, a few doors down from his most talented rival. 500 years later, we've turned his best guesses about the ancient world into our own certainties about his.